William Shakespeare, also known as one of the finest playwrights to have ever existed. William was born on 1564 on 23rd April. His father, John Shakespeare, was a local globe maker and his mother was Mary Arden. They were not very rich but also not very poor. Later, his father, John Shakespeare, also got promoted as a mayor of the Stratford, even though that ended very tragically, as he was caught in a situation where he was trading wools illegally. Under the rules of Queen Elizabeth back then, he could not trade wool without her permission or paying heavy taxes. As a result, he was fined heavily and lost much of his wealth. As a result, young Shakespeare could not afford to study anymore. At the age of 13, he had to give up his schooling. He studied in the local school of Stratford, the King's School. Even by age of 13, he had already learned a lot of grammar and literature. He studied classical literatures of playwrights like Plautus, Sophocles, and Seneca. Young Shakespeare also had a lot of experience of the elite class people. As his father was a mayor once, he got exposition of the elites, which also helped him later to write tragedies like Macbeth and Othello. And in 1582, at the age of 18, young Shakespeare got married to a much older woman, Anna Hathaway, who was at least 7 to 8 years older than him. And they had 3 children. The first, Susanna, a daughter, and later a pair of twins, Judith and Hamlet. Unfortunately, Hamlet dies of plague, and many of the scholars assume that Hamlet's death inspired Shakespeare to write Hamlet, which is one of his best tragedies ever written. It is also assumed that young Shakespeare was actually seduced by much older Anne Hathaway, who was already over 25 years old, and she had to do it because back then women got married much younger. At the age of 15 to 16, their parents would start to look for husbands for them. But she was already way past that age, so she had to make sure that she got married. Otherwise, the people would assume that she is a witch and the consequences are very bad. And after that, from 1585 to 1592 is a very important phase of Shakespeare's life. These 7 years are also known as the lost years because in that 7 years, what happened to Shakespeare is pretty much unknown. We do not have any data of what Shakespeare did. We don't know how he went to London and started writing. But there are many theories that try to fill up this gap. Someone says that Shakespeare started to teach in his local school. Someone says that he became a soldier and started to wander around the country. Many assume that he joined theatre in Stratford to a group which was sponsored by Queen Elizabeth to spread propaganda about her. And there is also a funny theory which suggests that Shakespeare was caught poaching in a local deer farm, so he had to flee to avoid consequences. But again, these are just speculations and theories. We don't certainly know what happened to those 7 years. But the time we first got to know about him again was 1592, and by the time he was pretty famous enough to be known and criticized publicly. We know for sure that he moved to London alone and his family stayed back in Stratford. But the question is, why to London? Why not some other cities? Well, for that, you have to understand what 1500s London was like. London in the 1500s was not any normal city. The population was exploding. It went from 50,000 to 200,000 in a very short time. Trades were expanding as a river and sea was very close. Merchants were rising from makers to bakers, from priest to lawyer. Everybody was gathering in one city. Middle class was booming. For the first time, people had both time and leisure to entertain themselves at the end of the day. And under the rule of Queen Elizabeth, the political stability was very good. And also after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the English nationalistic emotions were very high. People started to go more and more voyages, which also helped the economy. So back then, if you had the talent and the desire to grow, London was the place to exercise yourself. Just like writers moved to Paris and today tech billionaires move to Silicon Valley. Initially, Shakespeare was just an actor. He would rarely show his scripts to the director. But very soon, the directors realized that the scripts the Shakespeare said were very popular. They brought the most amount of audiences and profit. But even then, he could not earn a lot. At max, he would get paid from 6 to 15 pounds for each script. But over the years, he became an important part of the Chamberlain's Men's Theatre, which he worked in. His first complete work was The Comedy of Errors, which made him a lot of money and brought a lot of fame. Also, one of his most successful plays back then was The Henry V. This kind of plays were historical plays. Historical plays are basically plays that are based on real events and figures. And for materials, he would most likely look into the Raphael Holland sheets or Chronicles of England and Ireland, which were published on 1577. One of his most famous characters back then was Falstaff, which brought him a lot of success and fame. Falstaff was a character from the play of Henry IV. This character was very unique and different. He was fat, cowardly, and drunk, a knight who lies constantly and dodges responsibility, talks about honor, and somehow becomes more human than the actual king. And people liked this character. People liked this character was unlike anything they have ever seen. It was so much fun to look at. This character became so much famous that even Queen Elizabeth would personally call William Shakespeare and make this play happen. And it is also said that Queen Elizabeth personally requested William Shakespeare to write a comedy on this character to see how this would show up. After the death of Queen Elizabeth, James becomes the King of England, and he sponsors the Chamberlain's Men's Theatre. So they changed the name from Chamberlain's Men's Theatre to the King's Men's Theatre, which later establishes the Globe Theatre, the final home of Shakespeare. But even then, his success was not because of the king or the queen. His success lies in his audiences and his ability to understand his audiences and deliver what they wanted. His biggest strength was understanding human psychology. He was an entrepreneur first and a playwright later. He understood what the market, what the audiences demanded, and he could provide that, which made him money and the greatest playwright of all time. His audiences were mostly common people and the middle class, and sometimes the elites. They were bakers, craftsmen, sailors, and teachers. They would do a lot of physical work the whole day, and at the end of the day, they would want to rest and to be entertained. And there were many ways for that. There were red light areas, brothels, and bear baiting and theater. Bear baiting is basically there would be a bear who is tied up, and there would be a lot of hungry and dangerous dogs. And people would bet on them who would eat the most, who would hurt the most, and if the bear would survive or not. It was literally that bad. And people enjoyed that because there was no such thing as animal preserving back then. It was pretty common. So now you have the idea, you can guess what kind of competition Shakespeare had, and yet he succeeded. And not only that, his competitors as playwrights were Christopher Browley and Ben Jonson and many others. They were highly educated and serious writers. Still, Shakespeare outperformed all of them. He wrote in such a language that even the foolish person could understand what was going on the theatre. And there would also be such complex situations that would entertain the scholars, the elites. He wrote for all, and they all wanted to watch him. Because if you did not write very well back then, you surely would not survive the market. And more importantly, you will be washed and drowned with rotten potatoes, tomatoes, and eggs. So you had to make sure that you go well home. And in a very short amount of time, Shakespeare became very successful and rich. Other playwrights were so much behind and jealous of him. Playwrights like Robert Greene literally openly criticized him, calling him a upstart crow. But that meant nothing because he was already so much successful and rich. When the King's Men Theatre established the Globe Theatre, he was not only a playwright and actor, but also an owner. He literally owned around 20% of the entire company. He not only earned from scripts and acting, but also from ticket sales, profits, and so on. At the peak of his career, Shakespeare would earn around 300 to 400 pounds a year. For comparison, a teacher or a farmer would earn around 10 to 20 pounds a year. Surely he was not king's level rich or aristocratic level rich, but he was more than rich enough. And he did not mindlessly spend all of that. Back home, he reinvested those money. He invested his money in real estates and lands. And at one point, he owned over 112 acres of land, which was literally equivalent to the entire state of Stratford. He also secured a coat of arms for his family, upgrading his status from middle class to gentleman. Because even at that time, society was hierarchical. He could be rich and still a low class. His plays are full of comedies and violence, which the audiences liked a lot. He also used universal themes which were relatable to the audience, like jealousy, love, betrayal. He became so famous in London that almost everyone would recognize him. But unfortunately, all this glory came to an tragic end when his Globe Theatre was burned down during a play. During the play of Henry VI, they used real and practical cannons, and unfortunately, all of the cannons were wrongly aimed, burning down the entire theatre. And this burning down of the entire theatre had such an effect on Shakespeare that he almost stopped writing. It is considered that The Tempest is his last known writing. In his career, his entire estate was worth around 1,000 to 1,600 pounds, which is obviously not a billionaire level but still very rich. Because considering that most poets, most writers would really be very poor and starve to death, he was a complete opposite. He was not only a genius in writing but also a great businessman. William Shakespeare passed away in 1616 on 23rd April, which also happened to be his birthday. Thank you for watching, and yes, if I made any mistake, missed any points, or you have any suggestions, then please do let me know in the comments. I'm still learning and growing. Also do like and subscribe as a small creator. It is so much needed and appreciated.